So welcome to episode 5 of the We'll Figure It Out series. This is a spin-off interview series arising from my book, The Power of Us. And we're looking specifically at how we want to live in a post-COVID world and who are the people who are going to help us solve the many problems that we're currently facing. And after having spent 2 weeks talking to how business leaders and particularly visionary business leaders like Gary Ridge and Terry Young are coping, we're back on the territory that we started with, which is about education and how we prepare young people to not just survive in the post-COVID world, but to thrive. And that's a bit of a clue for my interviewee, because it's Valerie Hannon, who's written a book called Thrive. Valerie and I go back a long time. We've been working together for a long time. We've written similar kind of books covering complementary areas. But I specifically wanted to talk to Valerie about the books she's got, and she has 2 new books in the pipeline, and to get her take on what are the broader issues that are going to arise for education moving forward. She's hugely experienced and incredibly smart, so I know you're going to enjoy this. So this is a bit weird. This is a little bit like talking to your sister, because Valerie and I have known each other for 12 years? Maybe more?
Surely.
Possibly more. And we worked together a lot during that time. So, and she's here. We're actually socially distanced, as you can see, but we're in the same room together. Do you just want to explain how we've worked together and what kind of things we've done together?
Sure, and it's good to be doing this. It's an interesting kind of retrospect.
Yep.
We've both been writing, I think, in adjacent areas, which is about looking to futures thinking and a future focus to help us redesign what education and learning should look like. And I think that's always been driven as well by a kind of social passion. I think neither of us are conventional educators. We've both had odd careers, and perhaps that's partly connected. But our writing and our research has looked at themes, I suppose, which is around the liberation of learners, the connection of learners to the real world and its problems and what we face as communities and societies. So I've done, I suppose, 3 books in that space now, you in 2, which have had themes which are very, very closely connected and also nicely complementary of each other. And we've also worked on long-term projects with real people, with real schools over periods of time, both in the UK and in Australia. So, yeah, it's been a really interesting professional, personal, moral journey almost, I think.
And I think because we now do quite a few workshops together, we're constantly kind of banging around ideas, and certainly as I was developing ideas for Power of Us, we were working together quite a bit, so it was great to be able to try out some of those ideas. But I particularly want to talk about your last couple of books before we get on to the next couple. Valerie is a ridiculously prolific author. She makes me feel very lazy. But if people haven't yet seen this one, it's called Learning a Living. It's beautifully illustrated, isn't it? The photographs are just, I was looking at it again today. It is really gorgeous. And we'll get on to the book that followed that up. But before we do that, can you just explain the title?
Oh, well, surely it's self-explanatory.
Oh,
I mean,
sure.
The book, by the way, is so lavish with photographs and so forth because it was the WISE book, the World Innovation Summit on Education. They commissioned it, and therefore I had a budget which I don't usually manage to command, and a wonderful photographer called Rhea, who himself is a social activist, who was prepared to go to all the case studies that we looked at and spend time there and photograph them. So the photographs are very beautiful. I can say that because I had nothing to do with them. But we were asked to look at innovators who were trying to bridge the gap between learning and work. And it's a well-known gap. It's not a very well understood gap. The kinds of solutions that are typically or conventionally derived around it are what fail for a start, and also do a disservice to education, because I don't think anyone who thinks about it deeply and carefully would want to say that education is all about economies and work. Still less as this century wears on. Something we profoundly agree about, I think. However, obviously, young people find the idea of earning a living absolutely central to their purpose and their growing need for independence. And notwithstanding what kind of solutions societies might come to in terms of shrinking levels of high-value work as robotization and artificial intelligence and automation come to play, irrespective of all of that and the nature of work, still finding meaning and purpose in work is really critical to humans' existence, I think, anyway. So I wanted to, in the title, capture this notion that it is about life after learning, but it's not, because the point is learning now needs to go on forever. And so one of the things we found, of course, that the real innovators in this space are those who understand that learning doesn't stop at 18 or at 21 or at 25. It is a lifelong process. To be successful in almost any field, you have to be a learner, a deep learner, a learner with breadth. And so I just wanted to have this play on the idea of earning a living to learning living, a title which I would say does not translate well into other languages, as we quickly found. So when the book got translated elsewhere, people say, learning, what is that? In English, it has a kind of a resonance, but that's why we chose that title.
Right. And I think it is interesting how many ideas in education sometimes take such a long time to kind of work their way through. We've been talking about lifelong learning for at least a decade and a half, and yet here we are now. It is a real thing.
It's the reality, yeah. And I mean, the old title really used to mean, university of third age, evening classes, hobbies, maybe another language for when you go on holiday. Now it's the reality of earning a living. I mean, if you can't understand that you need to continue learning almost on a daily basis, you're in trouble.
Yeah. So I was fascinated to see this quote again, because Learning a Living came out a little bit, but not much. It was in the same year, a little bit ahead of Open, my first book. So we're talking 2013. And I know that writing The Power of Us, I had to go back to how the world looked in 2013. It was a very different place. So there's a quote here which says, the current period of flux, this is writing in 2013, represents a tremendous opportunity to shape a more dynamic, more sustainable and equitable world. However, without conscious effort, it could just as easily lead to the opposite. So where do you think we are on that pendulum?
I don't know that it's a pendulum. I feel it's a tipping point. And prophetic words, I think, because where we stand now is at a kind of a cross, and mixed metaphors here, but a kind of a crossroads where, on the one hand, you see the kind of phenomena that I think you were writing about in The Power of Us, and which we will return to, very powerfully written about, I have to say, where social movements, where people are, and folk working in localities, in communities, are starting to feel their power and starting to feel that they can take more agency and more control over their daily lives, contrasted with what we are seeing at the macro level, which is a profoundly dangerous point, I think, where people are almost giving up on democracy, where I've written elsewhere, and I continue to believe, and indeed now there's a slew of books. You go into any bookshop, you'll find a whole shelf full. The death of democracy, the twilight of democracy, the threats to democracy. Why? Because we see across the world the rise of nationalism, populism, strongman leaders, and people not prepared to fight for the notion of democracy, which, after all, has, in many cases, not delivered for them and has disappointed them. So we are, I think, at a really dangerous point where in countries, societies where you wouldn't have dreamed that the basic tenets of democracy could be at risk now are. I don't think I have to fill that in. I hope I don't. And for me, this is a massive problem or issue for education to address. The idea that education somehow stays aside from all of that or apart from it is, in my view, fatuous. This has to be one of the major foci for learning and for schools and for universities and others, which is to enable young people to understand what's at stake here and to prepare them to reinvent a form of democracy that can work for them as individuals, for communities, and for our planet. Yeah. Because the other major casualty arising from all this, of course, is our planet. So it's interesting hearing that again, and I still think it could go either way. And people felt like that in the 30s, and so it came to pass.
Yeah, yeah, and I guess that's the, if you like, the huge political upheaval which is taking place. But at that point, it seems to me we weren't fully cognizant of things like artificial intelligence and the huge impact that will have, you know, in our lives. You visited not just education locations. You looked at businesses and not-for-profits and cooperatives. Do you think people then were as aware of the huge changes in the world of work which have occurred since then?
Oh, well, which have occurred since then. I think that the speed with which things have happened perhaps would not have been predicted at the time. But no, I mean, I think I think of outfits like Infosys in India and one or two others, yeah, who well understood aspects of what is coming and were very keen to prepare their people with the kind of leadership qualities, the kind of resilience, the kind of futures literacy, frankly. Futures literacy is a concept that really interests me a lot now, to cope with all of that. So some did, some didn't. I mean, you know, these things are very contextual.
So in terms of, there's just a ton of really great quotes in this book, but one that I'd like you to unpack a little bit is one where you say, education is more necessary and more overrated than ever. What do you mean by that?
I don't remember writing it, but if you say that. Well, I suppose...
I think it was partly in referral to the way in which recruitment of talent is starting to change now, and perhaps the weakening of currency. That was my reading of it, but I don't want to put words in
your mouth. That's part of it, I think. So one dimension of it is that it's no longer possible to rely on paper qualifications anymore and assume that they will enable you to craft a path or to design a path through life. As the millions of underemployed graduates in low-value jobs, you know, whatever that might be, flipping burgers or at the moment, of course, not even doing that, would attest. So it was partly touching on the point that it's the quality of learning rather than the paper qualifications out of a period spent in education that really matters. The point about education there is that we're asking harder questions about its value and purpose, which of course the two are profoundly connected.
And that's probably not a bad thing.
I think it's an excellent thing.
Yeah, yeah. Because you also in Learning a Living talk about that paradox, which is often referred to as the skills gap, that on the one hand, we could be facing massive youth unemployment, but on the other hand, there are jobs which just can't be filled. Yeah. And I wonder, to what extent do you think, in terms of universities, the rubber's starting to hit the road because typically the degrees, the professional jobs that required the kind of degrees that are the university's bread and butter are no longer the case because of automation. I'm thinking of the legal profession and those kinds of jobs.
Well, certainly nibbling at the edges of those. I mean, I don't think they're entering the core, the heartland of it yet. But yeah, sorry, I interrupted.
But no, I think it suggests that, you know, that of all the layers of education, the one where it is really starting to demand transformation is at higher education.
I don't know of any university that isn't really having to think hard now about its relationship with its community, about its overall purposes for society, and about how it designs learning in the profoundest sense. So I think that the whole movement around, based in Paris at the moment from the Centre for Research in Interdisciplinary Universities, is a significant development in which they are arguing and modelling, showing how it can be done, that universities need to be interdisciplinary, and they need to be challenge-based. And that really shifts, you know, thinking away from the notion of either completely professional disciplines or subject specificity. Now, there's still space in that for scholarship, for research, But these are questions which are only just starting to be answered with any degree of urgency, because it is urgent now.
And let's talk about Thrive, which came out 2017, is that
Yes.
right? Yeah. Because it seems to me in Thrive, you kind of took a step backwards and looked at an even bigger picture. It wasn't just about work, training, learning. It was the whole of society. So just explain the premise of Thrive.
Well, the premise of Thrive is a simple one, which is that we have not, in the last several decades, I think, been prepared to ask the question, what is learning for? And what is the purpose of schooling? Two questions are not identical, but they're very closely related. And I don't believe that we will see the kinds of changes that many of us have been advocating for, and a kind of a small scale, and unsuccessfully, until people start to face that question first and foremost. And when I sat down myself and thought about all the movements, all the shifts, all the factors that seemed to me to be at work, I was driven by the idea that what we really need out of learning in schools and beyond is to enable us to thrive and to redefine success for thriving in the 21st century and its conditions. And why that term? Because it seems to me that we face a future, or we're in currently now, where so many aspects of our being are dysfunctional. First and foremost, our relationship with the planet is dysfunctional, and we can't thrive if our planet doesn't. And therefore, learning needs absolutely to be focused on how young people start to develop a different relationship with their environment, whether at the local level or indeed more broadly the globe. How does that become not a peripheral issue in learning and education, but central to it? That's one dysfunction that needs addressing. The second level, if you like, of thriving was communities, so often, so much across the world now, disfigured by profound inequality. And as I said already, threats to democracy which make one fearful for their future. I'll say with inequality for a moment, the obscene differences in wealth and well-being in many societies between those at the top and those at the bottom, which no thinking human being can possibly justify. So thriving communities surely has got to be a huge part of that. The third level was thriving interpersonally in terms of, all the research shows that what makes for a good life are good relationships. Certainly true in my life. So how do we enable young people to develop thriving relationships? And again, I think in the last few years, social emotional learning has become much more centre stage. But it's still somewhat peripheral in many circumstances. And it is a valid focus for learning. It's not a matter of what your family's like or good genes or good luck. It is something that we can intentionally design for, how to create and maintain good relationships. And then, of course, the final level is to thrive intrapersonally. And we've talked oftentimes about the epidemic of mental ill health in the richest and in the poorest of societies, and the relationship between that and well-being in your own body, taking responsibility for the well-being of your own body, understanding how your body works, what's good for it, what's not, as well as a sense of inner peace, identity, knowing who you are. So my thinking process went through what's learning for, what are the challenges that face us, understanding, I think, that we stand at a point where we have to really focus on how it is we start to thrive and not just get a job or become successful in the old conventional terms. And at this point in history, I wanted to argue that we're at three sort of pivot points. One, around the planet. In the next 10, 15 years, we may be beyond the point of no return. So it is urgent. The second area was in relation to technology and where the robots are taking us, our relationship to artificial intelligence, its connection to us as humans. And the third pivot point is our species and where it's going in terms of our own evolution and us taking control of our own evolution. That's a very convoluted kind of summary of the background to asking, where are schools addressing these levels of thriving? What does that look like? So that's where it came from.
And you and I have done many workshops in different parts of the world with educators around these ideas. And often the typical response would be, we completely get it. This is the kind of education we want to be providing for our students. But somehow there's a sense of frustration that they won't let us. So what do you think needs to shift to bring about an education which is about thriving?
Well, I think it's happening. I really do. And I'm not known for my optimism, so I don't say this lightly. I've always argued that we need a new narrative around education. If you ask a set of parents, what do you want really for your kids to thrive? And they sit back and think about, what's a good life? What's a good life now? Those are profound questions, but it's those that will lead to, I think, different conditions in which educators can do the kinds of things that you and I have been inviting them to think about.
Sure, and I noticed, I think it was just a couple of weeks ago, there was an OECD headline where it said, coronavirus could change education forever. We feels like we're at that moment where perhaps the kind of transformation that Ken Robinson and people like that have been talking about for a long time could actually happen. But if you were a teacher in England listening to you describe that, it might seem very far away from, simply getting students through exams. Which parts of the world do you think are further along and that we should look to get inspiration from?
Well, I think some of the most interesting are where educators have been thinking about and learning from Indigenous learners. And because some of the principles of Indigenous learning, which those who haven't thought about it very much may think of as sort of primitive and underdeveloped. Two I would cite are British Columbia on the west coast of Canada, where they've done a tremendous amount of work now. In particular, for example, there's a whole sort of program of work on the First Nations principles of learning. And honestly, if any student of yours working on project-based learning or on the other kinds of programs that you run looked at them, they wouldn't demur, because the principles of First Nations learning embedded in that, I think that they fit beautifully. So British Columbia have done a huge amount of work on rethinking their curriculum and rethinking the kinds of assessment processes in order to support learning, not to judge institutions, but in order to support learning, can do. And that work was done in complete partnership with their educators. So this is not, having to ram something down the throats of teachers. It's something that they've been part of producing, and they feel is authentic, and that they feel a profound sense of ownership over. And the other area, of course, of the world where there's been very interesting learning reciprocally with First Nations is New Zealand. Tiny country, of course, but with a very proud history of innovation in education from all kinds of directions. But now increasingly, what Maori and Pacifica nations have to teach and to demonstrate in their practice, particularly in how learning is embedded in communities. It's not something detached from them, but that's just one area. And it happens that New Zealand's approach to, at a national level, thinking about what's an appropriate curriculum, what's the purpose of all of this, is really ahead of the game. So I just picked those two because they're so connected to the Indigenous. But then there are the usual suspects. I mean, Finland is doing fantastic work right now, having topped PISA and all of that, and it's not interested in it. It's really interested in thriving young people. As I think, unexpected countries like Singapore, whose line was always teach less, learn more, and think carefully. So very varied parts of the world, but you were going to say.
No, I guess I was just going to ask, given one of the quotes I use in the book is from John Hagel, where he talks about we're seeing a shift from scalable efficiency to scalable learning. And I guess to play devil's advocate, it would be, particularly when it comes to Indigenous cultures and learning from those cultures, how scalable is that, do you think, to big, because you picked quite small territories, I guess, in a sense. So how much is the message getting through, do you think?
Well, I think it will get through, because even on the old metrics, on the contemporary measures, these countries are doing far, they're outstripping their so-called competitors markedly. So it's not that you go down this path and everything goes to hell, far from it. What you get is motivated, engaged learners who can't be stopped from earning.
What people may not be aware of is that you're about to update Thrive. So what's different in the past 3 years that made you feel like you needed to update it?
Well, two things are happening in my work. One is, yes, the second edition of Thrive will be coming out, and it's updated in the sense that there are a number of things changed, but particularly additional looks at, firstly, the whole notion of learner agency, which of course is your profoundest theme, turning students into user innovators, not just user innovators, but also people with agency in the world. So there's a section on it in agency, much overdue, and also a section there now on learning ecosystems. So trying to think about how across the world we are seeing, as it were, the assets, the sequestered assets of communities starting to be liberated, or certainly there were before COVID, but let's think about what was happening before COVID put its icy hand around our throats, where many more organisations, individuals, businesses, civic society became engaged, deeply engaged, not at arm's length in the learning business. So I'm very interested in the idea of learning ecosystems. I've done some research on that, and so the second edition of Thrive kind of fills out that picture, really. But my latest work is not about Thrive. My latest work is around, actually, and this might sound strange, defending the institution of school, but only if schools are profoundly redesigned. So it's a look at the institution of school, and the provisional title is Can Schools Save Us? Because in the research I've done over the last 6 months, I was enabled to look at schools which are redesigned, are doing that according to a set of design principles, which I've kind of curated and synthesized within the book. But out of that, I've come across clusters of schools, categories of schools, who are intentionally squaring up to the big issues of our time. And I call them archetypes. One archetype, for example, which is committed to the idea that the focus must be on creating ethical leaders and giving their young people experience of and targeted opportunities to develop their own ethical leadership of a quite different order, the kind of leadership you're talking about in The Power of Us, actually, but from the very earliest ages. Another archetype, and this won't surprise you, is an archetype around the schools who believe that the fundamental focus and issue to be addressed is creating activists for the climate, for the planet, because without that, we're toast. And the young people who choose to go to such schools know that that's the business they're in. Of course, there are hugely complementary skills and competencies which run across these things. A third archetype would be those schools, and again, you've charted these, who are in the business of saying what we really need in this world of ours is entrepreneurs and change makers. So how do we create the circumstances in which over a period of 10 years in schooling, kids get the competencies, the skills, the experience, the resilience, all of those that you need to become an entrepreneurial change maker in this world. So why do I say all this? I say this because I profoundly believe that we need to support the reinvention of the institution of schools, because particularly at a time of COVID, when there's distance learning and all of that, people say, well, really, do we need schools? You get some great programs, use Khan Academy. In the States now, we've got pandemic pods, where people are, getting 6 or 8 kids around the table, great IT, great technology to support them. Maybe hire a teacher yourself, like a babysitter, but qualified teacher, come in, give some professional tweaking to this. Who needs schools? Well, I want to say that we dispense with these institutions at our peril, and that schools have a hugely important, profound role to play in our society. And so that's my argument there. Do not dispense with these institutions, but for God's sake, redesign and reinvent them.
But I wonder, in that shift, and it was interesting that you said, let's not talk about COVID, let's talk about what happened before, because I think what's happened during COVID actually supports a lot of what you're saying about that grassroots engagement. We've never seen parents more attuned to what their children are learning as we did during lockdown. But coming out of it, the institution of the school has, like you say, has had a number of challenges recently. We've also seen things like startup entrepreneurs getting into that field, and personally, I welcome it because I think they're bringing some fresh thinking. But in order to get beyond the beautiful exceptions, we still look toward government, I guess, to make those sweeping changes. And it kind of goes back to learning a living. What what do you think the role is for government in terms of innovation, more broadly, but also within the education sector?
Well, let me say, of course, I accept your premises that we need entrepreneurs, fresh thinkers coming into the space, and nothing is more important than those in, well, there are many things important, but it's an important dimension that they bring that into the sort of turmoil of change for learning. But we can't do without government on this. I mean, you know, why is education significant for states? Why will they never just say, it is the only institution that's actually mandated for everybody, and with a few exceptions for homeschooling, a tiny minority. Why? Because the state has a huge vested interest, not just in having, you know, skilled citizens for its economies, but also to reflect what it is that they think they stand for as a state. They are inducting their young people into the continuation of their nation, if you like, and of course the human race. So the governments, states will never pull out of this altogether, nor should they. But your question is the fundamental one, is what should their relationship be? I believe that they should be setting broad direction. I mean, you know, there are some great examples around the world, and I'll come back to Finland actually, because I think that's a great example of where they set broad direction. They set out high-level principles of what learning should be and what it's for, and they enable and empower educators to bring this into being in diverse ways. We were involved in a program, two programs actually, but I'm thinking particularly of Learning Frontiers in Australia, where a national body said, let us create a nationwide innovation lab of schools. And through their practice, enabling them to have great professional development, to share ideas, to learn from those, to bring in the best research that we can, that we use those as the kind of engine to drive change in our system. For me, that remains the best model for enabling change.
Okay, well, we're almost out of time, and people might have heard this rumbling of thunder which is gone, which is portentous, I think, when we talk about these changes, because I want to come to the main theme of this series of interviews, which is the question I ask in the book, which is, beyond COVID, how shall we live? And it seems to me, you know, you've already highlighted the kind of tipping point that we're at. How do you think we should best prepare our young people, and I'm going beyond just the institution of school here, and even beyond education necessarily. How should we best prepare them to solve what are some of the most complex challenges which haven't gone away? I'm thinking of the climate emergency, thinking about mass migration. You know, how are we going to give them a future where they can feel that sense of agency?
I think the first point to make is that the issue of values has got to be central to all of this. So creating conversations, both within the home and beyond, about what is really important in our societies is a starting point. Without the right frame of values, without an appropriate frame of values, all the competences and skills in the world are valueless. And we've seen that with some of those most malevolent movements in the history of our species. So a frame of values is completely critical to all of that. And that is a kind of conversation which, you know, has been shied away from. But I think issues like Black Lives Matter has forced conversations about values to the forefront. And increasingly, of course, Greta and other activists are requiring us to think about what is valuable in our world and, you know, what's worth fighting for. That's the starting point, because without that, nothing follows. Assuming that is going on, and young people are starting to develop their own frame of values, which, by the way, might be very different from our generational ones. I mean, I might raise the issue, for example, of transgender and gender fluidity, and some of the issues that for young people are very alive and very important. And for an older generation, you think, oh, you know, what?
Yeah.
So anyway, accept it's not that we are laying our values upon them, but enabling them to interrogate and develop an authentic frame of values themselves. Step one. Step two, then, of course, is in the frame of competencies and experience. So competencies are arrived at through experience. By competencies, by the way, I do mean knowledge as well as skills and attitudes and values. But that means the designed learning process has got to put young people in a position where they can engage with real world problems, and not that learning that, you know, the early years are a kind of dress rehearsal or a kind of preparation for real life which starts later.
Yeah.
These kids are living in their societies now. Young black kids are facing violence now. Kids in this country are facing hunger and poverty right now. And better off kids are seeing that, and that should be part of what they see as a space for action and for bringing their learning to bear on what they're doing. So I guess after the values piece, there's a whole piece around designing learning programs which are sure about developing rigorous and coherent frames of knowledge, but also engaging in the real world problems that your family, your communities, and beyond, you can see, and learning that even as a 12-year-old, even as a 16-year-old, you can make change and you can make a difference, and believe that. Because part of the scarred, disfigured features of our society, I think, is that too many of us believing that we can't make any difference at all, and nothing we do matters.
Yep, that kind of learned helplessness.
Learned helplessness, yeah.
But I guess they can only feel that they have some sense of agency if they're able to have some kind of the dignity of some sort of income. And we know that the recession that's coming after this, well, it's already started, is going to disproportionately affect young people. Do you think we're at a point where we need to think about some kind of structural financial support for young people?
Well, both of us have talked about universal basic income as an experiment, which has been experimented now with 10 or a dozen jurisdictions across the world. And I think it's just got to come back in focus. Really interesting writers have started to develop this idea and learning from the data that's emerging. And clearly, many societies have half moved into that with their job support scheme, furloughing and so forth, which is still sort of tied to the old idea about work.
Keeping your job.
Keeping your job when many of those jobs can't be kept. Perhaps nor should they be. So I think we're again at a kind of a tipping point or a crossroads around, are people going to grasp the intellectual and practical challenges faced by this shift in societies to look for completely different solutions, some of which are out there and are nascent, but not just go back to, I mean, I worry about some Labour Party policies that talk about work very much in the old terms of expecting that we can shore up old industries. Whereas, in another part of the forest, we can see what is happening in terms of the impact of artificial intelligence and automation at an incredible scale and an incredible rate. So what are the options? We have to face those problems completely honestly. And the potential outcome is, as you say, a more dignified life for more people. That's not to say it's an easy solution, because work has occupied such a profound role in all of our lives and in terms of our own identity. So how is that otherwise developed? But at least ask the question, at least start to ask the question with an honest eye to the real forces that are at work, rather than pretending we can go back to the future.
So final question is, you talked about being an optimist, even in spite of global pandemics and recessions. What is it that keeps you feeling optimistic about the future?
Well, I think having the privilege of spending some research time looking at the work of both institutions and individual educators and what can be achieved there does make you think, oh, this is doable. You know, if only more people knew, which is why it's worthwhile bringing another damn book into the world. You sometimes think, what am I doing?
Just what the world needs.
It's just what the world needs. But actually, the whole purpose of that is to say, look, guys, over here, and they're not on Mars. You know, they're not super people. They're not heroes. They're ordinary people, but who have become completely convinced by the need for and the possibility of a different way of doing things, and they are doing it. And you talk to their young people and you think, there you go. Replicate you in this country and beyond, and we can crack this. We can. It's the power of us. So fine.